Our second presenter is Mattias Nielsen from Copenhagen, speaking about how does gender diversity relate to research questions.
I've been using Mac recently, so it may take me a few minutes to make this work. I sent my
The second one.
Oh, yeah, there.
So you
Perfect.
can
Thanks
see
so
it.
much.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation. I'm Mattias Nielsen. I'm a sociologist of science from Department of Sociology at University of Copenhagen. I'm happy to be here. Very interesting talks, and a tough talk here for me to follow up on. I really appreciate it. So in my presentation, I will focus on the mutual relationship between diversity and relevance in science. And as I see it, this is a central but sometimes overlooked aspect of discussions of diversity in research assessment. And the main argument that I'll attempt to make is that demographic diversity, and in this specific instance, gender diversity, by mobilizing a broader range of perspectives, viewpoints, and so on, may improve the relevance of scientific research overall. So fundamentally, I use here gender diversity to open a question of how the demographic composition of the science system what it might mean for the methods and topics and themes being addressed in science. So let me start by directing your attention to a review study we published a few years ago. And in this paper, we distinguish between three different types of gender diversity in science. We have diversity in research questions, in methods, and in research teams. And gender diversity is commonly, of course, understood to refer to the gender composition of teams. But in this paper, we argue that research on gender also requires attention to the methods employed and the questions raised in scientific knowledge making. So the best understood approach, of course, is the question of gender diversity in teams. And diversity refers here to how different ideas, beliefs, and perspectives that different genders bring into the team might sort of lead to a broader cognitive diversity, you can say. And the impact of that have been studied and analyzed extensively in laboratory experiments and in studies of public organizations and corporate organizations based on administrative data. Much less so in science. So this is getting pretty old. I guess there's a few studies after this, but I think the pattern is the same, that the few existing studies that really focus on scientific teams typically evaluate research outcomes based on citations, publication productivity, and patents. And we reviewed research from 2006 to 15 and found that 11 studies on team performance in R&D, research and innovation, 6 that focus specifically on R&D firms. Of these, 5 found possible benefits of team gender diversity for innovation and technological advancement. But of those that focused on the 5 remaining that focused on academic research, only 2 find possible benefits. The other are null results. And I think there's a point to make here, which is that the classic sort of diversity performance argument known from parts of the business literature is perhaps less clear-cut when it comes to the academic context. And this is perhaps not also so surprising given some of the gender disparities we've been discussing in terms of citations, journal impact factors, and so on, that these may also reflect in these types of studies. But I also think it's critical that we broaden our thinking about team gender diversity beyond bibliometric performance. And the argument here I'll make is that we may miss the mark by restricting our focus to quantitative measures of impact and publication rates. And instead, we should start to think more carefully about the many ways in which diversity may shape the content of the scientific research. And this leads me to the second approach to gender diversity, which concerns diversifying research methods. And I'll elaborate further on this point in a moment. But let me just emphasize that integrating gender and sex analysis into research design has been documented over the past 20 years or so, increasingly can lead to new insights that enhance the validity and the precision of research in the STEM fields and medical field and the social sciences, where this tradition has been longer, of course. And this is demonstrated quite well in the Gendered Innovations Project, which has been funded by the EU, the NSF, and so on, and since the 2000s have been sort of developing methods and case study examples showing the importance of gender and sex analysis in the STEM fields. So the third and final approach to gender diversity concerns diversity in research questions. And this emerging area of research focuses on how the entrance of women into male-dominated disciplines, or vice versa also, may influence the research priorities and agendas. So a baseline here, or sort of a foundation from some of this, would be that historical examples suggest that women's headway into traditionally male-dominated disciplines has coincided with expanding research agendas. We can think of the proportion of women rapidly increasing during the 1980s and 90s in academic medicine in the US, for instance, and at the same time, the attention to increase to traditionally under-researched areas of women's health, such as heart disease, breast cancer, urology, autoimmune diseases, and so on. We can consider the rapid growth in women in primatologists in the 1970s and 80s, which actually coincided with new paradigms that debunk traditional sex-based ways of thinking about primate behavior. So the past 2 decades have had advancement in computational text analysis, which shows some promise in trying to tease out the links between diversity in researcher demographics and the diversity in research questions. And some of the examples, primarily descriptive here today, I'll try to sort of focus specifically on this relationship. So now let's turn to my first empirical example, which concerns the question here of diversity and relevance, but specifically with a focus on gender and sex analysis. So historically, the male body has been seen as the norm, and women's bodies have been systematically overlooked in social sort of and biological aspects of them in medical research. There's a lot of literature on that. And this lack of attention can undermine the validity and precision and relevance of medical knowledge, taking the average and disregarding gender and sex in disease-specific research. So let me start by giving you 2 brief examples of this. Between 1997 and 2000, 8 out of 10 medical drugs that were withdrawn from the US market posed greater health risk to women than to men. Something that different scholars have raised the question about whether that could have been avoided with more careful attention to these factors in medical research. About 10 years ago, another famous example here, the US Food and Drug Administration decided to halve the recommended dosage of the sleeping drug Ambien for women. And this is because women metabolize the active ingredient in Ambien more slowly than men, and therefore they're at risk of next morning drowsiness when they're in the traffic, so resulting in danger in traffic if they'd taken the full dosage the day before. And here the argument would be, with these typical examples, that some of these problems could have been avoided with more careful attention to these factors in medical research. And these and similar examples highlight the consequences of not considering sex and gender analysis. And there's been increasing focus on it in medical research. However, it still remains a challenge. Because during the COVID-19 pandemic, we carried out a study that examined the attention to sex and gender in COVID-19 clinical trials. And as you remember, early in the pandemic, it became clear that there are possible gender and sex differences in COVID-19 infection rates, disease progression, and mortality. Despite this, only 4% of the more than 4,000 registered COVID-19 clinical trials that we analyzed included an explicit plan to examine possible gender and sex variations in their trials. And I think more critically, only 8 out of the 45 published pharmacological trials at that point had reported their results by sex and gender. And this latter results is particularly surprising because most of these trials were published in the top medical journals, which have all sort of aligned with requirements of reporting sex and gender. Nevertheless, they were not there during this period. Yeah?
Why did they do that? I mean, if anything, they have a chance of finding more additional interesting results. It doesn't take much to correct for one variable, and you might learn something from it. Why would they not do that?
Why they wouldn't do it? There's a long discussion in medicine on that. One thing that's been discussed for many years and continues to be an argument is sort of the statistical power in what you're doing overall here as an argument for refraining from doing this, and a culture where this has not been the main focus of your analysis. Yeah, but it is interesting, an interesting fundamental question. So, and why am I giving you these examples? Well, in 2017, we examined the relationship between the gender composition of medical research teams and whether their analysis considered the sex and gender as an analytical variable in their published studies. So a bit more context, if we think about contemporary science policy, it's characterized by 2 main pillars. We have science policymakers like the European Commission, the NIH, and so on. On the one hand, they seek to advance the careers of women scientists, but a parallel objective that's become increasingly prevalent over the past 20 years or so is the question of promoting and supporting gender and sex analysis in science, in health and engineering research. So what we did in this study, because these two sort of policy pillars, you can say, are presumed to be related, but it's not really been investigated. So what we're interested in here is what's the correlation between the presence of women in the medical field, their participation, you can say, and then the attention to sex and gender analysis. And theoretically, this argument was motivated by insights from the literature on demographic diversity in organizations, where we see gender as a cultural category, as something that shapes experiences, worldviews, and perspectives, but also sort of broader studies on educational career choices and how they are divided along gender lines, and how this also reflects sort of these gender norms and expectations in society. So this leads us to the following conjectures. We expected that in disease-related medical research, the study's likelihood of examining or accounting for possible sex and gender variations would increase with the proportion of women among its authors. And moreover, we expected these likelihoods to be larger when the woman takes on the first or last author position in the studies, as we can return to. So we used data from Web of Science and PubMed to examine these questions. And we focused on the period from 2008 and onwards, where we have full name information for most authors in Web of Science. And a key challenge in this study, of course, was to discriminate between studies that do and do not integrate gender and sex analysis. But luckily, at that point, there was a systematic sort of monitoring of new studies in Web of Science that integrated gender sex analysis. We're a leading international group in Berlin on gender medicine, specifically used text mining algorithms, manual quality checks, and so on to specify whether a study included this type of analysis as part of its reporting. So this resulted in a database of tens of thousands of eligible studies, including gender and sex analysis. And we, of course, sort of tried to test the validity of that. And it's pretty strong in terms of the accuracy of the database. So we try here to match this database to Web of Science, where we have the information on authors. And as you can see, we have a match of 59% from the gender and sex analysis paper database into Web of Science, which corresponds to PubMed almost, because not all of PubMed is covered by Web of Science. So we predicted the gender of each author here based on Gender API, and named it to gender assignment algorithm, which takes into account the country of the first name and last names, and then does a prediction of the likelihood of that name belonging to a man or a woman. There are clear limitations of this, but that's the best we can do for these larger scale studies. And here's an overall distribution of women's shares of first, mid, and last authorships in our sample, or full representation, sorry. So these findings align well with previous studies, suggesting this clear sort of imbalance where women are clearly underrepresented as last authors, but are gaining representation as first authors. So here we present the main results in 3 logistic regressions with gender and sex analysis as the outcome. And these models estimate disease-specific medical studies' likelihood of examining possible gender and sex variations. All models include covariates to account for differences in women and men's research participation across geographical areas, across medical specialties, and across medical disease areas. So we use the medical subject headings to specify what's the representation of women and men within each specific disease area for these mesh terms. So the most intuitive way, I would say, of displaying these results is to compute the margins for main parameters of interest. And this figure specifies the estimated proportion of women on the y-axis for the 3 groups: first authors, last authors, and full group gender composition. And for instance, in studies omitting gender and sex analysis, women on average comprise around 40% of first authors, while they comprise around 48% of first authors in studies that include this perspective. And the relative difference, if we look at these marginal effects, is largest for the last authors, which also makes sense if we take into account who's really responsible for developing designs and leading these projects. So I think I'll skip this one. But so what, you might ask, for all of this? So why does this matter? Why is it important? Well, here's an image from a medical department at a leading international university. I came across this when I was working there some years ago. And here you can meet the faculty, you can meet the staff. And I believe the picture speaks for itself. If demographic representation is linked to the relevance of knowledge produced, there are still challenges within some parts of medical research, specifically at the most prestigious departments, at the most prestigious universities. So these points were recently supported by other studies, one recently in Science, which used methods similar to ours and showed that female patent developers in medicine are substantially more likely to develop solutions technologically and medically that specifically address women's health needs. So historically, this has also been an area that has been underemphasized, given the relatively low proportion of women inventors in medicine. So here the authors conclude that rough calculations would suggest that if all the patents invented between 1976 and 2010 had been produced by men and women equally, then there would have been around 6,500 more female-focused inventions in the US. So other papers coming out of economics further expands this argument, and now with explicit ambitions of sort of teasing out the causal relationship here. Because one of the challenges of my work previously is the association might go the other way around, right? Like these areas, the focus on gender and sex analysis may attract more female researchers into them. So focusing on clinical trials, a recent working paper by Harsh Gupta at Stanford documents a clear positive effect of women's representation as medical PIs and PIs of clinical trials and the representation of female patients in these trials. Another area of medicine where there has been imbalance and women have been underrepresented as participants in trials. And this is an important finding given the clear historical underrepresentation of women in these trials. So another cool study by Francesca Truffa and Ashley Wong, recently accepted also in AER, documents how the transition of all male US universities to mixed gender university education, which is known as co-education, led to a 44% increase in gender-related research publications at these universities compared to the control group of all male US universities that did not make such a transition. So with these recent examples, we can perhaps start to presume that there's also a causal relationship going on here. So my second empirical example concerns the field of history. And here I will adopt a longitudinal perspective on the relationship between changes in the gender composition of the field of history and the questions and topics addressed by US-based historical researchers over time. So this study is based on digital text analysis and specifically correlated topic models of a large corpus of full-text history articles published in American journals since the 1950s, but also abstracts from all American PhD dissertations in history since the 1980s. So you should think about this as an attempt to provide a bird's eye view that allows us to sort of see how the gender demographics of academic history are connected to the viewpoints, questions, and areas addressed by researchers. And in this analysis, we show that as women entered previously male-dominated fields in history, the diversity of research topics expanded. This figure is cross-sectional and does not really detail the historical evolution of topics, but it illustrates a clear gender variation in research interests. For instance, women have been very active within topics such as consumption and consumerism, body history, and sexuality. And here's an example of the concrete developments within family history. So from the 1970s onwards, we see a substantial increase in the prevalence of the family topic in historical research, with women pioneering research on this agenda. And this is especially true for subfields of family history, such as household history and child history, fields that barely existed before women started entering the field of history in the US. However, the changing gender demographics are not only a question of new topics being raised, put on the agenda, it's also about changing the content of existing topics. And this is illustrated by the dissertation titles here, that women, for instance, have contributed new perspectives on topics that are heavily male-dominated, such as American military history, hereby contributing to diversify the topic over time. So in a previous study, we've shown similar gender variations in research specializations within management research based on latent Dirichlet allocation, unsupervised topic models, of virtually all management research published between 2008 and 14 in Web of Science. So we show here clear gender variations in this field, with women management scholars being well represented in more social and human-centered areas of management, while men comprise the vast majority in areas that address more sort of technical and operational aspects. And we interpret this as an indication of how a broadened repertoire of perspectives, values, and questions result from gender diversity of fields that may render and make this field more responsive to societal needs and expectations overall. So to briefly sum up this point before I turn to my final point, my point here is not to essentialize gendered ways of conducting research. We need to be very careful about that. But my point is that a diverse research system can generate a broader area of perspectives, values, questions, which may better reflect and address the diverse needs of and expectations of society. And in the example of disease-specific medicine, it fundamentally relates to the relevance and the validity of the medical knowledge. And in the example of academic history, I think it concerns whose history is being told and becomes part of our shared understanding of our society. So it can also be sort of trying to make a case for the importance of diversity. There are also some pessimistic insights to note here. In the study of management, and on the sort of horizontal segregation of topics in management studies, we also find some evidence that female typical topics are underrepresented among the topics that are most likely to be featured in journals listed in the top business management journals rankings, such as UT Dallas, the Financial Times ranking, and the AJG 4-star journals. As you can see in the forest plots here for one of those journalists. And here the topic financial governance is treated as a reference. It would also belong up there, and that's why some of the top journals even are close to sort of zero effect. But you can see that the male-dominated topics are at the top. Most of those are dominated. They have a higher likelihood of being present in these top journals in management. But there are also other status differentials to think about here that may be more important. We can think about, for instance, looking into global surveys, as we did, of business and management schools, and look at what are the salary levels for different topics. And here we also see that some of these variations reflect different salary levels. HRM researchers are simply have lower salaries than researchers in finance, for instance. And we can start to see some of the same patterns that the status hierarchy is present within here. So I would say a pessimistic reading of this result would be to point to sort of the pioneering work of labor sociologists Reskin and Roos on what they call the gendered ghettoization of occupational fields, that when women make inroads into male-dominated fields, subtle forms of gender segregation tend to persist. For instance, they may be ghettoized into less prestigious and well-paid work areas. So I have 2 minutes left, I think. So for those 2 minutes, I want to sort of add another perspective on this. Recently, research assistant Julienne Larec in Canada and I got access to funding data from Western European funding agency. We do not have identifiable data on authors, but we have information on all submissions, rejected and accepted, their topics, their abstracts, the age and field of the applicant, and so on. And what we're interested in here is to combine a mixed methods approach, talking to panel members about how they assess this material, and looking also into the potential role of knowledge hierarchies in driving some of the gender disparities in funding. So thinking about how methods may matter, topics, disciplines may matter in this sort of interdisciplinary social science council. And what we found here overall is a difference in the sort of descriptive difference in the likelihood of receiving funding for women and men. Is a relative difference around 20%. So out of the 10 years of funding, if women had the same funding rates as men, they would have 2 more years of full funding here. So even the small difference here tell that these differences make a difference over time, right? So what we did here is pretty simple, and you should think about it more exploratorily than as sort of a causal claim, but we tried to look at how much do topics, discipline, methods mediate the difference in the likelihood of receiving funding here. And what we see is that that's around 1/3 of the gender difference is attributable to these findings. So we were interested in what's going on here because it's a question about women specializing in methods, in disciplines, in topics that are perhaps less likely of being seen as meritable in the system. And when we started talking to panel members, we also see sort of a clear disagreement in the panel, that there are different groups perceiving this in different ways. Here's an example of a sociologist panel member who describes how qualitative work was systematically sort of devalued by other disciplines in these shared assessments. Whereas, interestingly, if we look at political scientists with a quant background or economists, they tend not to see these controversies. They more thought about it as sort of meritable, consensus-based discussions. So there are clear sort of battles in the council about what kind of research was perceived as being meritable and fundable. And I'm highlighting this to sort of make maybe a for you sociological claim that when we think about gender here, what do we mean by gender? Because a lot of recent studies focusing on gender disparities in funding have tried to just provide, for instance, abstract of funding applications varying the name of the applicant and then assessing is there a bias or not. But what is gender in academia? That's also specializations in terms of topics. That's also where you end up. It's all part of the social construct of gender. And therefore, we should also interrogate how topics, how methods, how disciplines may lead to disadvantages and how these disadvantages may be gendered. Thanks so much.
In the book Invisible Women, but for me in that, it was just fascinating to read that up until the early 2000s, one of the, I'll call it excuses, used by pharmaceutical companies for not doing adequate research on the effects of different medications on women is because of hormones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and pregnancy also. Yeah. Yeah.
Pretty shocking when we're talking about science.
Yeah, and it's a culture that persists 20 years later, which I think is even more scary to some extent, although it's getting better, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, I missed it if you said, but on the slide that showed the difference, the women were getting 30% less funding than men. Did you take into account age with that?
Yeah, this sort of estimate holds when we also take into account age and when we take into account discipline and so on. We have a little bit of a challenge in estimating these models because we had an affirmative action program in this council. And that program actually decreased overall the level of funding for women substantially because all women applied for that funding and the success rates were 5%. So we had to also sort of estimate these models where we removed that program to make it more realistic. So this is sort of in the regular programs. Yeah. And a lot of it, if you delve into the data, actually is also economics have incredibly high success rates in this council. Women are underrepresented in economics, and women economists applying have lower success rate than the male economists. So part of it is also related to that in this specific council. But remember, we only have cross-sectional data here. We can't really trace who the people are and so on.
Okay, thank you so much.